You're listening to Mad Radio. Mad Radio. Mad Radio. Make a difference.
Quick, me lads! Hoist the rigging! Aye, Captain! Splice the main brace! Batten down the hatches!
Aye, Captain!
I'm going below deck to get the show started.
And now, the man who got kicked out of a junior college, and now he works at one. Ha 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 ha! It's Mr. I don't know, 2 plus 2, Mr. Dum Dum himself, Brandon McCarty.
Well, thank you, Petey. Hey, welcome in, all you scallywags, you swashbucklers, landlubbers, hornswogglers, and salty dogs to the Peg Leg Podcast, a show where we delve into the lives of fellow pirates and learn a bit more about the unsung heroes among us all. Arr! This week we travel to the School of Behavioral and Social Sciences to speak with an individual who was born in Oakland, California, but completed his K through 12 in Havana, Cuba. He returned to the U.S. at the age of 18. Check this out. He graduated with a B.A. in history from UC Berkeley with his senior thesis on the Independent Party of Color of Cuba, an Afro-Cuban political party brutally repressed in 1912 in the so-called Little War of 1912. He received his master's degree and a doctoral candidacy in history from UC San Diego. He is working on an unfinished PhD thesis on the political culture of the Cuban peasantry from 1900 to 1959. He was focusing on comparative slave systems, race relations, and social movements in Latin America and the U.S. He has traveled extensively in Brazil, Uruguay, Paraguay, Argentina, Chile, Mexico, Cuba, and Spain, and we will certainly talk about those travels a little bit later. He has worked at MJC from 2000 to 2022 teaching history. That would be Mexico, Latin American, and U.S. history. He has spent 3 terms, not consecutively, I don't believe, as the MJC Academic Senate president. He has a commitment to democracy and social justice, and we will certainly talk about that as well. His hobbies include cooking, traveling, reading, asking difficult questions, I like that one, playing the devil's advocate, and finding common ground, also cultivating friendships. He is currently the dean of the School of Behavioral and Social Sciences. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the poop deck, Curtis Martin.
Hello, fellow pirates and colleagues.
My goodness, you've lived quite the life so far.
I have. It's been a long journey to MJC and to where I am currently.
Well, I mean, since you just brought it up, let's talk about it. How did you find your way to MJC?
Okay. I was doing graduate work at UC San Diego, and at that time, I had become divorced, my first marriage. I had 2 children who moved back to Oakland, and I started looking for jobs that would put me closer to my children. And MJC just happened to be one of those places. I applied, and I got the job. And I was much closer rather than 500 miles away, 75 miles away from my children.
So that was it. It was just, I applied and boom, and
that was it.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, that's how it used to work anyway. So then where did you grow up?
Where I grew up was in Cuba. My dad was a journalist, both a print and radio journalist.
Okay.
And apparently in 1961, he found that there was this interesting process happening in the Caribbean and decided to go there. Now, this is before Cuba declared itself socialist, so it just seemed like another of those Latin American revolutions that recur periodically. So he took us there. But actually, he arrived a month before, and a month after he arrived, Bay of Pigs happened.
Yes.
So I have some nice pictures of him covering Bay of Pigs. We arrived May 15th, a month after Bay of Pigs. April 15th and we arrived a month later. And then the rest is history. I did all my elementary school and all my high school in Cuba, in Cuban schools. They didn't have any other type of schools. My first language is Spanish. Even though my parents spoke English to me, I grew up in a Spanish environment. So, in fact, my parents' Spanish was a source of embarrassment to me because they couldn't speak it that well. But obviously, I was fluent in it. And so I did that until I was 18. And then at 18, I made a decision that I wanted to return to the United States to study here in the United States. And that's what I did. It was difficult. We had no money because in Cuba, you don't make dollars. You make pesos, and those pesos are not interchangeable in the world market. And starting going to community college almost immediately and working also. My first job, I remember, was in Round Table Pizza, making pizzas, washing dishes. Round Table Pizza, you do a little bit of everything, cashier.
Right.
So
was it a massive kind of a cultural
shock?
Yeah. Was it a massive cultural shock to come back and what was that like? You'd been to school there, and so now you're in community colleges here.
So I'm not sure I would use the word back, because back implies I remember I was I was 1 year old when I ended up in Cuba.
Right. So that was your world, really.
That was my world. And yes, I spoke English imperfectly. I had an accent. I didn't understand the culture. The 60s and the 70s had happened here, and that had left me behind because the 60s and 70s in Cuba had been entirely different.
I'm sure, right.
Different sets of beliefs. And so, yes, probably culturally was the biggest shock. It wasn't the political system. It wasn't anything else, but understanding even cultural references.
Right.
Those took me years to sort of, I call the 1980s my lost decade, because it's the period where literally I couldn't quite find myself in the United States culturally. I learned a lot through television programs, though, to start understanding American cultural references.
Did you find that there were a lot of similarities, or were they just really kind of grandiose ideas that they were portraying on television? That's very interesting to me.
Well, it's from small conversations. People in every country make cultural references that refer to a television program, a piece of music, something that everyone understands as their reality. I didn't have that frame of reference. For me, it was all outside. And sometimes you'd go to a party and you feel you have nothing. I could talk politics. I could talk about Cuba, but I didn't understand the American mindset particularly well. It took many years. I feel like an outsider in many places.
Right.
And especially coming from Cuba, for those who were, I guess, more progressive and left-wing, it was the question, why did you leave Cuba? Sort of accusingly. And for the other side politically is, what were you doing in Cuba? So
you couldn't win.
I couldn't win either of the arguments, yeah. So eventually, though, I made a set of friends, and those friends sort of indoctrinated me into some of the aspects of American culture. I had very difficult time with English. I always tell everyone I failed bonehead English 3 times when I went to college. The third time they said, if you don't pass it, you're out of here. And I finally squeaked by in it. And that was a sort of a trauma to be sort of corrected and then constantly being asked, where are you from? People never assume I came from Cuba. They assume I came from Canada or from Germany or from other places by looking at me. And
interesting.
That was a source of a little bit upset for me.
So, did you play any sports in Cuba at all in school? Or?
And we didn't, informally, yes. I love baseball, and I love swimming, and I lived fairly close to the ocean, so summers were always in the ocean. I mean, every day in the summer was in the ocean. And baseball, yeah, I love baseball with a passion.
Awesome.
And maybe boxing.
A little bit of boxing in there,
Yeah.
too. Well, we talked about some of your hobbies outside of work. If you would just kind of talk about some of those things that you find yourself doing on, I guess, the weekends or when you have time available.
For those who know me, cooking probably is one of the things I enjoy most. I worked in restaurants, mostly as a dishwasher. I also worked in a chocolate factory for 2.5 years, making chocolate truffles. I started as a dishwasher, move up to chocolate truffle maker, not troublemaker, but truffle maker. And then I guess, I'm not sure if it was a promotion, but then I became the truck driver, driving around the Bay Area, delivering the chocolates for the factory. Those were to help pay for college. So I was going to college and paying for college at the same time.
What was the company that you worked for?
It was called Cocolat. It was a Berkeley-based company. It's since it gone out of business for a while there, though. It was probably the most high-end chocolates you could get anywhere in the Bay Area.
Very nice. All right, so you like cooking.
I love cooking.
Any particular kind of dish that just really sets you off?
Well, no, that's what I like about what I do in cooking. I try not to replicate a lot of dishes. But of course, coming from Cuba, Cuban cuisine is front and center of anything I can do easily. Cuban cuisine is, I call it sort of a Midwestern Latin American. They don't do spice in Cuba, for example. A lot of people think anywhere south of the border, people like spicy food. That's not quite true.
Right.
In Cuba, spice is black pepper, maybe a couple of grinds of black pepper. That's considered spice. But it's very spice food. It has a lot of garlic and cumin and laurel, but it's not spicy. And then after that, of course, south of the border, Mexico, I think, has one of the most complex and sophisticated cuisines. Not necessarily in Modesto, where it seems to see the menus are interchangeable in Mexican restaurants, but when you visit Mexico and you go down to the south, or you go to the Gulf Coast, or you go to the north to the Pacific Coast, very different and distinctive forms of cuisine that are very, 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 I wouldn't call them highbrow because they're not, but very different than what sometimes Americans consider Mexican cuisine.
Okay.
So, but from there, Spanish, name it. I think cuisine is one of those things. Eating and eating with friends is probably one of the things that brings us closer to each other. And certainly sharing a meal or a glass of wine or a beer or a glass of water, for that matter, can bring people together to talk about, in a more relaxed environment, about all kinds of things. And I hope it builds trust. That's always
Right.
It's not a aim that I'm doing a meal. It's so we can relax, but not necessarily. But I think that's one of the outcomes.
That's when you can start to play the devil's advocate, and you can ask the difficult questions.
Yes. I sometimes drive some of my friends crazy. I've been known to be a provocateur, a contrarian, and sometimes at work to ask very difficult questions that are not particularly appreciated in some venues. But I think it helps move things along.
Right.
Ultimately, the questions are asked so that we can move things along, not necessarily so we can prevent them from happening.
Absolutely. You also read. Any particular author that you enjoy, or?
I'm a big fan of American detective novels of the 1930s and 40s, the Dashiell Hammetts, for example. And it's sort of a source of embarrassment because I'm supposed to be reading academic and historical books, which I enjoy, but not as much as that whole genre of mystery detective novels. The same for movies. I sort of enjoy. I grew up reading in Spanish Sherlock Holmes by Conan Doyle, and it always stuck with me. And Allan Poe actually is considered one of the first detective writers. He has a couple of stories that, and I love Allan Poe as well. So those are my fun readings. And a lot of it is, in terms of history, I love reading issues that analyze historical developments. I especially liked looking at the long, what a very famous French historian called Fernand Braudel used to call the longue durée. I like to look at historical patterns over a long run and compare it to what's happening, for example, currently at any point in my life.
Right. Interesting. Unfortunately, America doesn't have a long history, so there's not much to talk about yet.
I disagree, but
well, I think we've gone. Well, okay, true. Maybe it's by decades, and not so much by hundreds of years.
Yes, absolutely.
What is something that you pride yourself in?
Besides my cooking?
Besides your cooking.
Yeah.
And if you keep talking about it, I'm gonna have to. We'll have to share a meal at some point. So.
Gladly. Probably my children. I mean, at a personal level, my children and my commitment to ensuring that my children are well prepared to face the world. It's always a difficult task because it doesn't matter what you do, children have a mind of their own and they develop in different ways. And sometimes they make us very happy and sometimes they give us, they're a source of enormous concern. And I'm happy to say that at least up to now, I have 4 children. They all like me and still recognize my my weaknesses. So.
Well, that's a plus right there. Now, is it? Do you have all boys, or do you have a mix? Or
my eldest is a girl, and then the 3 others are boys. So.
Which one did you have the most? I won't ask you which number you had the most difficulty with, but which gender did you have the most difficulty with?
Actually, all the stories I was told about girls or about boys, I can't. Maybe it's the way that I approach life. It's just life. It's who they are. And nurturing is a difficult. You have to nurture each kid differently. They were not all the same. We loved them the same,
right.
But they all had to be nurtured in different ways. So I can't point a finger and say, maybe that's not the way I think about it. I look more at what they have and what they offer, what they're lacking. Maybe self-defense. I don't know.
That's a good answer. I like that one.
Yeah.
If you have to get to know your kids. Yeah. Obviously, you birthed them, so you have to. They're figuring you out, and you're figuring them out, I guess, at the same time. What would you say motivates you?
What motivates me the most is when we can make and affect change that is positive and serves, I don't want to sound preachy, but the larger community, whether it's students or, in this case now that I'm in an administrative position, faculty or staff, to create a esprit de corps, a sense of belonging, which is in a way what you're trying to do with this podcast. And I think the best way to do that is by getting to meet people and engaging with them, share a meal with them. We have different positions of power or relative power at the institution, and sometimes we're not in the military. It's not a top-down, but sometimes it can feel that way. And I understand power, division and power politics, but ultimately, at least institutionally, we have a goal, which is to make our students succeed. So what inspires me is when I feel that there's that sense. When that sense of cooperation, of community is missing, it makes it more difficult to step into a workplace. So.
All right. Well, I guess this will flow right into that answer. What do you like about the MJC community as a whole?
Its potential. I think the more I get to know it, and I've been fairly close to the community because I participated in many different, the more I know it, it's nurturing that potential. I think that if we could nurture that in the right ways, what we can do is transformational. We're already transformational, but even more transformational. I go back to the sense of a sense of belonging. When I first came here, I went to the first Institute Day, and I've always lived in large cities. I'd lived in San Diego. I'd lived in the Bay Area. I'd lived in Havana. I lived for a few months in New York. So this was the smallest place I'd ever lived in. Havana is a city of 2 million, so it may be in the third world, but it's still a large city. And I went to the first Institute Day, and I laughed so hard. Yeah, it was at the State Theater when I got here in the year 2000. And they had videos poking fun at ourselves, at our problems, in a friendly way. And my first thought was, if we can laugh about ourselves, we're doing good. I think we've lost a lot of that spirit of sort of poking fun. COVID hasn't helped. It may have worsened the issues. So one of the things that now that I'm in a position and in a different position is to try to nurture, to see if we can have that spirit, or at least part of that spirit. I mean, this is called the peg leg. It has a pirate, or two pirates. Maybe it's the same pirate looking at each other. And I think we need to bring a little bit of that spirit back. I work in a community college, and it was a conscious decision. I was not trained to work in a community college. I was trained to work in a 4-year research institution, and the decision was very conscious, to the dismay of my advisors. And what I liked was that word, the community. Online education has sometimes made it difficult to create that community.
Right.
COVID has made it very difficult to create that community. But I don't think all is lost. I think a lot of it need that human context. So,
where are some of your favorite places to eat?
in Modesto?
In Modesto, or their surrounding areas? Or are you going to say that you'd rather stay home and fix your own stuff?
I no, sometimes you want to go out and have a meal. I love, believe it or not, I think they have one of the best salsa jalapenos right out the street from you here. I think they have one of the best salsa bars. I always laugh because you go to San Francisco to a place like Tacolicious, and they'll charge you $12 to bring you 3 little salsa. They're delicious, but 3 little salsas with chips, where you go to jalapenos and
just as have at it.
Yeah, have at it. I like Bauhaus.
Okay. Yes.
As well. It's a very, very nice place. It reminds me, it's the tapas concept, the small dishes, and I love tapas. It's a nice concept. You don't have to eat a huge meal. You can have a nice drink and then have a nice little meal. You can make a whole dinner out of it by ordering multiples, but I like it. Other than that, I think the food, what I miss here is not enough good barbecue, for example. At least I haven't found a place that I would say, and I'm not talking about chains, I'm talking about local places.
Right.
Notice I've mentioned places that are local. And I'm trying to think. I eat, the Chat House on Sisk. Is it called Chat House? On Sisk, there's an Indian grocery store right by Target. Across, right, you know where Rogers Jewelry is?
Yes, it's in that same area right there.
Yeah, right there. There's a Indian place,
okay,
which is a market, but at the back it's all vegetarian, but it's a chat. If you know, chat is the concept of the tapas,
yes,
but Indian style,
yes,
small dishes. And I find that place lovely for a really very reasonable price. You get your rice, your pulses, lentils, and some sort of vegetable. They usually have 3 or 4 different vegetables. And then there's a new place that opened on Beckwith that I like, which is Southern food, what was it called? There used to be a restaurant there if you went out on Beckwith. Catfish House?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Way out there. Okay.
Yeah.
Yes.
A new Southern place with gumbo and fried catfish and fried chicken. And if you like fried chicken and fried catfish and gumbo, it's a good place to go.
That's the place. Huh. I'll have to check that out.
Yeah.
Who has been your biggest influence, either professionally or personally or both?
Well, it depends on the stage of my life. Of course, your parents always have. My dad was a journalist, so academically we could always talk. He was an author as well. so we can always engage. My mother, a visionary. So I guess growing up, those two. And throughout my life, I've had a series of friends who've influenced me. So I can't speak of one. I can speak of really a community of friends over the years who've served. What I've discovered with age is that we tend to have friendships through cycles. It's not that they stop being friends, but especially when you're moving around or they're moving around in the academic world and they may be in New York or they may be in Washington.
Right.
You create, it's very different when it's an immediate day-to-day. But probably the people who have had the biggest influence on me have been historical figures that I've admired, whether it's Antonio Maceo, one of the leaders of Cuban independence, or Jose Marti, another leader of Cuban independence, or I know it sounds cliche, people like Martin Luther King, or even people like Malcolm X. Not saying I necessarily agree with everything, but that sort of spirit of trying to change the world. Now, I've mentioned all men. There's also women in there that we can mention. But I think the people who influence me are the ones who want to change the world for the better. That's at the very top level. Personally, it's been friends who've guided me through difficult moments in my life. And but I can't think of one that I would just say this is the person who's given me.
Right. Just a whole menagerie, if you will, of people. Well, if you had a free plane ticket to anywhere in the world, where would you go and why?
Many places, but right now probably Turkey would be.
Turkey?
Yeah.
Okay.
I've traveled somewhat in Europe. I've traveled in Latin America. I've traveled extensively. 2 years ago, we did an 8,000-mile trip through the United States. And that would put me sort of in the near Mid-East, a place that I don't know very well.
Right.
I've been to North Africa, but very shortly. So I'm interested in a completely different culture. And of course, it's a beautiful country, but more importantly, the food.
The food in Turkey
is apparently spectacular. So that draws me. Cultures that have very developed sense of a culinary tradition. I mean, it's a millenarian area, thousands of years to develop sort of cultures and the influences. It's been a place of transit of many different cultures at different times, with many different religions at different times. So I think, yes, I'm attracted to those sort of rich, deep cultures that run into places like Turkey. Now, it could be other places in the Middle East. It just seemed the safest place right now.
Well, so then if we lifted the question a little higher then, and everything was safe, like it was anywhere where would it be a different answer if you could go anywhere, if it was going to be completely safe, or?
Well, still the Middle East. I'm very attracted to the Middle East. I think Lebanon, again, the food, Israel, India, Vietnam, Thailand. I mean, there's a lot of things in my bucket list that I probably won't do, but that I would love to see. India fascinates me. It's a country of 1 billion people with talk about the multiplicity of ethnicities and cultures and foods and religions and just complexity. What I'd be afraid is I'd have the tourist view. I wouldn't understand the country. It'd just be, look at this monument and look at that monument and miss what the country is all about.
Right. You almost have to have that immersive experience.
Yeah.
If you only had 3 albums that you could listen to for the rest of your life, what would they be and why?
Probably one of them would be The Wall, Pink Floyd's The Wall.
Okay. All right.
Yeah. It's a very particular moment. I happen to have gone to a couple of their concerts. But it made me feel, what's the term I'm trying to, The Wall makes me feel, again, the possibility of change, because some of those parts of that song were taken to as an anti-apartheid. But mostly it makes me feel, what do you call it when you feel añoranza? There's a term in English. I just can't think about it. It made me turn inward. It makes me a little bit sad, in fact.
Okay.
Which is not a feeling I reject. Sometimes it's nice to sort of have that. If I think of the word, I'll come up with it. Second album would probably be Silvio Rodriguez, who's a Cuban author and singer, just because it's the kind of music that speaks a language. Frankly, I consider he's a musician, but probably closest, but he's a poet. If you take his songs and you put them out in words, it's poetry. What I like about it is his images are not didactic. A lot of times singers sing these songs that leave nothing to the imagination. With someone like Silvio Rodriguez, his songs can be interpreted very, very differently depending. And I tend to like those musicians that leave a little bit to the imagination, not what this means, because it's obvious, but what made those things mean in the song. And then, of course, call me an oldie, maybe again, because I grew up the Beatles. The Beatles have a deep impact. I mean, I listen to the Beatles and memories come flooding through just because they've been with me since I was a kid, and they continue to be because they're very popular. Even my kids love the Beatles, and they listen to the Beatles.
Any particular era
of the Beatles?
No,
you're right. I mean, Abbey Road is one of my favorites.
Okay.
But the White Album, some of the earliers, the White Album, the only one I can think about now is number 9.
Yes.
I think that's what, I don't know what it's called, but number 9. So those would be the 3. I mean, there's other musicians I like.
Right.
One of the interesting things, I grew up in a very musical country. Cuba is, it's a powerhouse when it comes to music and dance. And I have to admit that I love music. I'm not good at music. I listen, I'll move, but unfortunately, something happened that imprint I didn't bring with me in a way that I would have desired. All Cubans can move and dance very well, and they can remember songs. Not my forte.
That's okay. That's okay. Sometimes just listening to it is enough.
Oh, yeah, listening as much as I love listening to music all the time, and I'm not particularly, I'll listen to everything. I like some country music because it reminds me of certain Cuban genres. It's all about tragedy, betrayal, and love. And so some country music sort of, even though it's a completely different musical style,
right,
the words of them, so things like Patsy Cline, for example, just touch my heart in the deepest places. It reminds me of certain Cuban genres that sort of that addressed some of the same topics, but that may be just universal topics: love, tragedy, betrayal.
If you would, do you have any parting words of encouragement for us?
Yes. Look at the positive. Look around you, what's good in your life, and just keep moving. I mean, it's I think I'm always amazed we don't stop to see, having grown up in a third world country where poverty is fairly widespread, I think sometimes we forget that the enormous advantages that we have in terms of resources and things here you take for granted, which is a car, would be like an ultra luxury items in many places in the world. So I ask people to take a step back and look at all the good things they have in their lives, and to be kind to each other. I guess the golden rule, treat other people like you'd like to be treated yourself, should be a guiding principle.
Curtis, thank you so much for being on the podcast. We finally got together. We had a little bit of difficulty, but we made it. And again, I appreciate you being here, and thank you so much for allowing us a window into your life.
Okay, thank you, and it's been a pleasure.
Well, the winds are picking up, and the barnacles are collecting on the bow. Time for us to set sail, me hearties. This episode was brought to you by the Baseball Hall of Framers. That's Framers. Produced by the only man they could find to do it. Yeah. Edited by that one-eyed cockatoo over there, Patchy the Parrot. And music by Fidel's Flute Fellows. Hey, I hope you're enjoying the journey. Stay tuned for many more adventures to come. And as always, remember to keep your booty close and your sword sharp, lest you find yourself swapping the deck on the bottom of Davy Jones's locker. Until we meet again.